Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're taking your sources and building a personalized roadmap to deep understanding.
And today, we are really diving deep.
We are. We're tracing the genealogy of what one of our sources called, and I love this phrase, an inorganic heartbeat that shakes the world from Berlin.
German techno history. It's a sound that, for a lot of people listening, is just part of the modern club scene.
Right.
But its roots are so specific. I mean, we're talking about a genre that's defined by, strict repetition, a really severe minimalism, and this powerful industrial sound.
And we've got a fantastic stack of research here that really maps it all out, from its explosion in the late 80s all the way to what's happening right now. We'll be walking through the key cities, Berlin, Frankfurt, and looking at the actual institutions, the clubs and labels that made it a global phenomenon.
And our mission today isn't just a history lesson on music. It's about understanding a cultural product. German techno is so deeply woven into city life, into a whole lifestyle.
It really is.
And it's a sound that has just refused to go away. It's kept this huge international influence for decades, always changing, but always keeping that core identity of cold, mechanical precision. It's a fascinating look at how music and a place can become one and the same.
So let's start at the beginning. The Big Bang. The sources are really clear on this. German techno didn't just, slowly grow. It was a rapid rise, late 80s into the early 90s.
Yeah, explosion.
And it was kicked off by one single massive historical event that gave the music all of its raw, urgent energy.
And if you want to understand this whole thing, you have to start with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989.
Of course.
This wasn't just a political moment. It was a physical and a cultural fusion of East and West Germany, just shattering decades of total separation.
And one of the immediate results of that was, physical space. Suddenly you had all these empty buildings, right?
A vast supply. You're talking abandoned factories, old warehouses, even bank vaults in what used to be East Berlin, just empty, available space.
Perfect for parties.
The perfect unregulated venues. I mean, there was no bureaucracy. You didn't need permits. It was just concrete and freedom.
Wow.
And just like that, Berlin becomes this mecca for techno. The music itself, which was rough, it was experimental, often pretty harsh, became the literal soundtrack of freedom, the sound of opportunity in the middle of all these ruins.
So how accessible were these places? I mean, was the city government just looking the other way, or was this all pirate activity?
In that very first phase, a lot of it was pirate activity. It was all happening in this kind of legal gray area.
Okay.
The city was dealing with huge political changes, so this little club scene was flying way under the radar. And that just, fueled the experimentation, the speed of the BPM.
And the scene formalized pretty fast around some key institutions. Our sources point to two big ones. First, the club and label Trezor, which started in 1991.
Yes.
The sources say it was crucial for bridging Detroit techno with Berlin's new, harder sound.
Absolutely. Detroit techno, the original, had this soulful R&B element to it, from pioneers like Juan Atkins and Derek May.
Right, the machine funk.
Exactly. Trezor was flying these guys out to Berlin, connecting them with German producers. But the Germans, they took that machine sound and they stripped the soul right out of it.
And replaced it with
a harder, more linear, and very European coldness. Trezor was literally built in an old bank vault. The atmosphere was part of the music.
And while Berlin was doing that, you have the other hub, Frankfurt. And there, it's all about Sven Väth and his labels, Harthouse and IQ.
You can't forget Frankfurt. It was so important because it was pioneering hard techno and at the same time the beginnings of trance.
Two genres at once.
Right. Sven Väth showed that German electronic music was this powerhouse of evolution. It wasn't just copying America. It was building multiple distinct subgenres that could go global.
And that focus on the cold, hard, repetitive rhythm brings us to the core aesthetic. If you're listening to German techno, what makes it sound like German techno?
Our sources boil it down to three key things.
Okay, what's the first one?
Minimalism and repeatability. This is where the German sound really breaks away from its American roots.
How so?
Well, Detroit techno often had these soulful or even jazzy bits. German techno was about reduction. It's mechanical, it's linear, it's all about the hypnotic power of repetition.
So it's about subtraction, really.
It is. It's about subtracting until only the functional rhythm is left.
Now, what does that mean for someone on the dance floor?
It means the focus isn't on melody, it's on texture and rhythm. You're not waiting for a vocal hook. You're just being pulled in by the relentless forward motion of the beat.
The BPM?
The BPM, the beats per minute.
Yeah.
When we say it's fast, we mean it's built for nonstop, high-energy dancing.
Which leads right to the second point, the industrial influence. It's building on the legacy of pioneers like Kraftwerk. It's the sound of the machine.
It's deliberately inorganic. The sound in the late 80s and early 90s had this rough, experimental feel. Cold textures, repetitive synth riffs. You can hear that it's unpolished.
The sound of the concrete walls you were talking about.
Totally. It's raw, heavy bass, often a little bit overdriven. It sounds like a huge industrial machine. And it's not trying to sound warm. It's channeling the city's infrastructure.
And the third characteristic is its total integration with club culture. The club and the music are like one thing.
Inseparable.
We talk about places like Berghain and Trezor, and it's clear the music is part of this whole lifestyle experience.
And that's such a crucial point. The music is basically written for that space. The club's environment, the darkness, the severe concrete architecture, it's part of the composition.
So listening at home on your laptop is a totally different experience.
You're missing half of it. The sound is designed to work with the reverb, the bass frequencies, the physical punch of the kick drum in that specific enclosed room.
Okay, let's get into the evolution, because it's not one single sound. One source had this incredible observation about the overall pattern, a kind of sonic cycle.
I love this part.
It goes from industrial and cold to minimalization to hardening, then melodicization, and then right back to reindustrialization.
It's this perpetual engine. It's constantly pushing its own limits and then snapping back to its industrial core. That's why it's lasted so long.
So let's trace that cycle. Early 1990s, the expansion period, rave culture is just exploding in those empty factories you mentioned. Trezor just opened in 91.
And what you hear in this period is that quick shift away from the Detroit sound. It's influenced by Detroit for sure, but it gets harder and more linear very fast.
How fast are we talking?
BPM's often 140 or even higher. Yeah. It's got that inorganic, raw, industrial feel. This is where you get that fertile mix of early hard trance and hard techno.
And who are the key artists here?
You've got Sven Väth, of course, the machine gun percussion of Hard Floor, and the really deep foundational textures of Maurizio, who you might know as Basic Channel.
Then we move into the late 1990s. This is where things get refined. German labels are now getting famous internationally.
Yeah, the scene is maturing. And this is when minimal techno really comes into its own. The tracks are stripped down to their absolute core.
Just a few elements.
Few elements. Clicks, percussion loops, and a huge emphasis on that hypnotic repetition. And that soulful element from Detroit, it's pretty much gone by this point.
It's all cold and mechanical.
Exactly. And at the same time, you get the rise of this intense, distorted acid techno with that squelching sound from the Roland TB-303 synthesizer.
And who's defining this colder sound?
You see figures like Chris Liebing and Johannes Heil really pushing that hard industrial edge. They were all about maximizing the physical punch of the kick drum in that minimal style. Heiko Lau was also huge in refining that cold, almost surgical sound.
Then the 2000s arrive. Berlin is now a global club city. Berghain opens in 2004. How does the sound change with that international spotlight?
It's a bit of a paradox because you see it get both harder and more diverse. That hard, minimal, industrial style became the sound of Berlin techno for the world.
The default setting.
Yeah, the default. But you also see a huge fusion with groove-oriented tech house, which made the sound a little softer, a bit more accessible for international clubs.
And melody starts to creep back in here, too.
Absolutely. Paul Kalkbrenner is the prime example, especially with his work for the movie Berlin Calling. He showed that techno could have this emotional, lyrical side and still keep its rhythmic core.
And who else was driving this?
Artists like Len Faki, Monica Cruz, and Ellen Allien were all key in pushing the sound to new places and making it truly international.
So the 2010s were a really interesting time. EDM is at its peak in the US, this huge commercial thing.
Right.
And German techno seems to do the opposite. It doubles down on being the underground. This is when the Berghain sound takes over the world.
And you can identify that sound instantly. It's a heavy, really dense kick drum, a super dark, inorganic atmosphere. And it's actually slower than the early 90s stuff, maybe around 125, 130 BPM, but it has this enormous physical weight to it.
What were the influences that made it so distinct?
It's a reinterpretation of industrial music and EBM electronic body music.
Right.
Which is all about repetitive mechanical rhythms and aggressive electronic sounds. It's dark, almost meditative. And the key artists here are definitely the Berghain residents, Ben Klock, Marcel Detman,
And people like Stefan Bodzin on the more melodic side, and Nina Kraviz, who became this huge Berlin-based international star.
For sure.
Okay, so that brings us to now the 2020s, where post-pandemic, streaming is everything, club culture is being re-examined. Where's the sound going?
You see a few things happening. The harder industrial direction is still going strong with artists like Face Fatale or Kobosil.
A hard groove sound.
The hard groove sound. But you also have the melodic stuff, championed by acts like Tale of Us, becoming massive at festivals. And there's this really cool trend of people reinterpreting 90s hard trance and acid sounds.
So the machine is not just learning to feel, it's learning how to look.
That's a great way to put it. The 2020s are about adding emotional expression, even detailed visual production to the experience, but without losing that characteristic coldness. It just confirms that cycle we talked about.
Right. It hardens, then it softens, then it reindustrializes.
Over and over again.
We've mentioned a lot of names, but let's just zoom in on a few of the core architects that our sources really highlighted.
Okay. You have to start with Sven Van Veth again, from Frankfurt. He's maybe the most enduring symbol of it all.
And his big contribution was?
He internationalized the lifestyle. Through his Cocoon label and events, he turned it from a local scene into a global movement.
Then you have Ellen Allien in Berlin, founder of B-Pitch Control. She kept it from getting too commercial, right?
Exactly. She's always been focused on the underground, the experimental side. She makes sure the genre never gets lazy.
A great contrast to someone like Paul Kalkbrenner.
A perfect counterpoint. Kalkbrenner brought that melodic, almost cinematic techno to a huge mainstream audience with Berlin Calling. He proved it could be emotionally powerful.
And then, of course, the guys who defined the 2010s, the Berghain residents. Len Faki, Ben Klock, Marcel Debman.
Their sound became the global standard for dark industrial club techno for a whole generation. They really set the bar.
And finally, a name that's been a constant thread, Johannes Heil.
Yeah, he's a producer who has just consistently chased that hard, dark German techno sound for decades. He kind of embodies that pure industrial core that runs through it all, no matter the trends.
So when we put it all together, what does our deep dive tell us? German techno is this constantly evolving sound, but it's always tied to the political and physical reality of Germany.
It cycles from hard to lyrical, but it never really loses its status as, Berlin, the capital of techno.
It's the product of the wall falling, but it's also a laboratory for sound design.
That's the core takeaway. Listening to its history is how you can understand this dynamic, where cities, people, machines, and emotions all get tangled up together.
That structural cycle simplification, hardening, reindustrialization, it's so powerful. The machine always comes back to its core programming.
And it raises a really interesting, provocative question for you, the listener, to think about. We've seen the music evolve to include so much more emotion, more visual production in the 2020s. But if the fundamental core of German techno is that cold, inorganic heartbeat, that rejection of anything extra, what is the one minimal, unyielding element that will remain constant over the next decade?
That's a great question.
How will the sound protect its industrial soul while it keeps absorbing all these new emotional and visual ideas to make sure that aesthetic keeps spreading uncompromised from Berlin?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history and the persistent heartbeat of German techno.
See you next time.